My family of surgeons disowned me at 19 for refusing to become a doctor. They told everyone I had thrown my life away. My mother, a cardiothoracic surgeon with a wall of awards, told her colleagues her eldest daughter had chosen failure. My father, chief of surgery at the hospital that carries our family name on a donor plaque in the lobby, stopped saying my name at dinner parties entirely. For 9 years, I was the Harmon who didn't make it. The cautionary tale. The one they mentioned only to explain why they were so proud of my younger sister, who did it right. 9 years later, I walked into my sister's wedding, and the most powerful woman in that room, a woman my parents had spent a decade trying to get a meeting with, crossed the entire ballroom, in front of 300 guests, to shake my hand first. Before I tell you what happened after that, the sound my mother made, the way my father set down his champagne glass so hard the stem cracked, the thing my sister whispered to me at her own reception, you need to understand exactly why my family was so certain I had failed. And what those 9 years of silence were actually building while nobody in my family was watching. Please take a moment to like and subscribe only if this story resonates with you. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you're listening from right now. Now let me take you back, all the way back to a dinner table in Boston, and the night I told a family of surgeons that I was not going to become one of them. My name is Rachel Harmon. I'm 28 years old. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts, in a house that had been in my father's family for 3 generations. In a family where the word doctor wasn't a career, it was the price of admission to being taken seriously at our own dinner table. My mother, Dr. Eleanor Harmon, is one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in New England. My father, Dr. William Harmon, is chief of surgery at Brantley Medical Center, a hospital my great-grandfather helped found and which still bears our family name on a bronze plaque in the main lobby. The kind of plaque my father would pause in front of, almost unconsciously, every time we visited him at work when I was a child. There is a specific kind of family that treats achievement not as something to be proud of, but as something to be maintained, the way you maintain a historic building with vigilance, with a sense of obligation, with the constant low-grade anxiety that you might be the generation that lets it fall into disrepair. That was my family. We didn't celebrate accomplishments so much as we confirmed them, checked them off against a standard that had been set long before any of us were born. I have one sister, Vivian, 3 years younger than me, who understood the assignment from the time she was old enough to understand anything. Vivian wanted to be a doctor before she fully understood what a doctor was. She played with a toy stethoscope. She won the science fair 4 years running. She was, in every way our parents measured these things, the fulfillment of the Harmon standard, and I loved her genuinely and completely, even as I watched her become the daughter I was apparently failing to be. Because here is the thing about me. I was good at school. I was good at almost everything academically. I had the grades and the test scores and the recommendation letters to walk directly into any pre-med program in the country. And everyone in my family, from my parents to my grandmother to the extended web of aunts and uncles who were themselves doctors and lawyers and people who had maintained the standard, simply assumed that I would. I want you to picture the dinner table where I told them I wouldn't, because the specific details of that room have stayed with me for 9 years. It was a Sunday dinner, the formal kind my mother insisted on, with the good china that came out weekly rather than only for holidays because, in our house, Sunday dinner was a holiday. A weekly ceremony of the family confirming itself. My grandmother was there. My father had opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving. And I was 19 years old, home from my first year of college, and I had decided that I could not spend 1 more year pretending toward a future I did not want. I'm changing my major, I said, into a lull in the conversation. I'm not going to do pre-med. I'm switching to design. The silence that followed that sentence is one I can still hear 9 years later. My mother set down her fork with the specific precision of a surgeon setting down an instrument. Design, she said. Not a question, a diagnosis. Industrial design, I said. Product design. I've been taking studio classes and I'm good at it. I'm really good at it. And it's the first thing I've ever done that feels like it's actually mine. You're throwing away a medical career, my father said, for arts and crafts. I want to be fair to my father, even now, even after everything. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way he would have delivered a difficult diagnosis to a patient with a kind of grave certainty, as though he were telling me something true about my own body that I was too naive to understand. In his framework, he genuinely believed he was saving me from a catastrophic mistake. That belief did not make the next 9 years hurt any less, but I understand now that he thought he was being a good father, which is somehow both better and worse than if he'd simply been cruel. My grandmother, 81 years old, a retired pediatrician who had been one of the first women to graduate from her medical school, looked at me across the good china and said the sentence that would echo through the next 9 years of my life. No Harmon has ever chosen to be ordinary, she said. You'd be the first. I left the table. I left the house that night actually, driving back to my dorm 3 hours early because I could not breathe in that house anymore. And over the following months, through a series of increasingly cold phone calls and one final devastating conversation in my father's study over winter break, My family made their position clear. If I insisted on throwing away the future they had planned for me, I would be doing it without their support. Financial, emotional, or otherwise. They did not use the word disowned. My family was far too polished to ever use a word that dramatic. What they did instead was quieter and, in some ways, worse. They simply began to withdraw the tuition support. First, which forced me to take on loans and work through school. Then the phone calls thinned. Then the invitations stopped coming. By my second year, I was no longer expected at Sunday dinner, and no one had ever formally told me I was uninvited. I had simply been edited out of the family's ongoing story, the way you'd edit an inconvenient sentence out of a paragraph. I want to go back further, because I think you can't understand what my choice cost my family without understanding what being a Harmon actually meant, day to day, in the years before I broke the standard. When I was 7 years old, I brought home a drawing from school. A teacher had pinned it to the wall and given me a small ribbon for it, some elementary school art contest. The kind of thing that means nothing and everything when you're 7. I ran into my father's study to show him, ribbon in hand, and he looked at it for exactly 3 seconds and said, "That's nice. Did you finish your math workbook?" Not cruelly. He wasn't a cruel man. It simply did not occur to him that a drawing could matter. Art was a hobby, a decoration, a thing you did when the important work was done. And I was 7, and I understood, in the specific way children understand things they can't yet articulate, that the part of me that had made that drawing was not the part of me my family valued. I stopped showing them my drawings after that. I kept making them under my bed, in notebooks I hid, in the margins of the math workbooks I was supposed to be finishing. But I stopped showing them, because I had learned the first and most important lesson of growing up in my family. There was a correct kind of person to be, and the things that came most naturally to me were not part of it. When I was 12, I redesigned my own bedroom. Not decorated, redesigned. I drew floor plans. I figured out how to reposition the furniture to make the small room feel twice as large. I saved my allowance for months to buy the specific shelving I designed the layout around. When my mother saw the finished room, she said, "Well, you certainly have a lot of energy for this sort of thing," in a tone that made this sort of thing sound like a mild affliction. My cousin Daniel, visiting that weekend, stood in the doorway of my newly redesigned room and said, "This looks like a magazine." He was the only one who ever said anything like that. He was 12, too. He had no idea he'd said the single most encouraging thing anyone in my family would say to me for the next 15 years. I'm telling you these small things because I want you to understand that my decision at 19 was not a rebellion. It was not a teenager lashing out. It was the surfacing of something that had been true about me since I was 7 years old, and hiding drawings under my bed. I had spent 12 years being quietly told that the truest part of me didn't count. And at 19, for the first time, I decided that it did. The first major holiday after my decision was Thanksgiving of my sophomore year. I want to tell you about it even though I wasn't there, because I found out the details later, and because it was the moment the family's story about me solidified from private disappointment into public fact. I had assumed I would still be invited. Naive, I know, but I was 20 and still believed that family was a thing that held even when it strained. I waited for the call, or the text, or the email that would tell me what time to arrive and what dish to bring. It never came. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I finally texted my mother, "What time should I come Thursday?" She wrote back, after 4 hours, a message I still remember word for word. "We think it might be easier for everyone if you sat this one out. Things are still a little raw. We'll see how the holidays go." We'll see how the holidays go, as though my presence were a wound that needed time to heal, as though I were the one who had done something requiring forgiveness. I spent that Thanksgiving alone in my dorm, eating a sandwich, and I told myself it didn't matter, and I was wrong. It mattered enormously, and I cried for most of the afternoon, in a way I'm not ashamed of now, but was deeply ashamed of then. Here's what I learned later, from Daniel, about that Thanksgiving I wasn't at. My relatives asked about me. Of course they did, and my mother delivered, for the first time in a public family setting, the line that would define me for 9 years. Aunt Carol asked where I was, and my mother said, lightly, as though it were nothing, "Oh, Rachel's taking some time to figure herself out. She's decided medicine wasn't for her." And then, the part that Daniel said made the whole table go quiet. "We're giving her space to fail on her own terms." Space to fail on her own terms. My mother said that about her 20-year-old daughter, at Thanksgiving, to the entire extended family, establishing in a single sentence the official record. "Rachel is failing. We saw it coming. We are being gracious about it." And because no one contradicted her, because in my family no one ever contradicted my mother, it became true. Not true, in fact. True in the only way that mattered to my family, which was true in the story they all agreed to tell. Daniel told me he almost said something. He was 19, same as me, and he said he sat there with the words in his mouth and couldn't get them out. Because contradicting Eleanor Harmon at her own Thanksgiving table was not a thing a 19-year-old had the standing to do. He apologized to me for that years later. I told him what I'll tell you now. The silence of the people who love you, but won't defend you, is its own specific wound, but it's a survivable one, and I don't hold it against a 19-year-old who didn't yet have the strength. I hadn't yet developed either. I did not know, for the first couple of years, exactly what story my family was telling about me. I only knew that I had become difficult to explain, and that families like mine do not tolerate things that are difficult to explain. They resolve them, they smooth them over. They find a version of events that lets everyone continue attending the same dinner parties without discomfort. The version they settled on, I learned slowly, was this. Rachel had struggled. Rachel had not been able to handle the pressure of pre-med. Rachel had, in the gentlest possible framing my mother could construct, found her limits. It was a story specifically designed to preserve the family's reputation while explaining my absence, not that I had chosen a different path, but that I had failed at the correct one and slunk off to do something lesser. I learned the specific shape of this story from my cousin Daniel, the one relative who never fully stopped talking to me, during a phone call in my 3rd year away. "You know what your mom tells people, right?" Daniel said, "in the careful way you deliver information you're not sure someone wants. She says you weren't cut out for medicine, that you took the easier road. She said it at Thanksgiving. Aunt Carol asked about you and your mom, just shut it down. Rachel took the easier road. We don't really talk about it, the easier road." I was, at the time of that phone call, working 40 hours a week at a design firm while finishing my degree at night, sleeping 5 hours a night, living on rice and frozen vegetables in an apartment I shared with 3 other people, and pouring every remaining ounce of myself into a portfolio that I hoped, someday, might mean something. The easier road. I hung up the phone and sat in my terrible shared apartment, and felt something harden in my chest that I have never fully softened since. But here's what I want you to understand about that hardening, because it matters for everything that comes after. It did not make me want revenge. I know that's what these stories are supposed to be about. I know you might be waiting for the part where I plot my triumphant return, but that's not what happened, and I think the truth is more interesting. What that hardening did was much simpler and much more useful. It removed, permanently, my need for my family's approval. And it turns out that a person who no longer needs anyone's approval is capable of working with the kind of freedom that people still seeking permission never quite achieve. I stopped trying to be understood by them. And I started, instead, to build. I want to give you a real picture of those years, because I started to build is the kind of clean sentence that skips over the part that actually mattered, which was how unglamorous and hard and lonely the building actually was. For the first 2 years after I finished my degree, I lived in an apartment in Somerville with 3 roommates, in a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and a desk, and I did my best design work on that desk between the hours of 9 at night and 2 in the morning, after my actual job ended. My job during the day was at a firm where I was the most junior designer, doing work that was competent and forgettable. And my real work, the work that would eventually become everything, happened in those late-night hours when I designed things nobody had asked me to design, solving problems nobody was paying me to solve, purely because the solving of them was the only thing that made me feel like myself. There was a specific night, in my 2nd year out, that I think about often. It was around 1 in the morning. I was working on a design problem that had been bothering me for weeks, a way to redesign a common surgical instrument so that it reduced hand fatigue during long procedures. I wasn't being paid to work on it. It wasn't part of any project. I was working on it because I had watched my father, years earlier, come home from a 12-hour surgery flexing his hand at the dinner table, and some part of my brain had filed that image away and never let it go. At 1 in the morning, alone at my desk, I finally solved it. I remember the specific feeling, not triumph, exactly, but a kind of quiet click, the feeling of a thing that had been wrong, suddenly being right. And I remember my first instinct, the reflex of a lifetime, was to call my parents and tell them. I actually picked up my phone. And then I remembered that there was no version of that phone call that would go well, that I would be calling to tell 2 surgeons that their failed daughter had, at 1 in the morning in a cramped apartment, designed something that might make their work easier, and that they would hear it as more evidence of my strange, misdirected life, rather than as the achievement it was. I put the phone down. I didn't call anyone. I sat with the solved problem alone, at 1 in the morning, and I let it be enough that I knew it was good, even if no one else would ever understand why it mattered. That was the loneliest and most important lesson of those years, learning to let my own knowledge of my own worth be sufficient, without anyone else's confirmation. It's a skill almost no one from a family like mine ever develops, because in families like mine, worth is always confirmed externally, always measured against the standard, always dependent on someone else's approval. I had to learn to generate it myself, from nothing, in the dark, at 1 in the morning, and it turned out to be the most valuable thing I ever learned. I need to tell you about my sister Vivian, because her part in this is more complicated than a simpler story would allow, and because what happened between us over those 9 years is, in some ways, the real heart of all of this. Vivian did everything right. She went to Johns Hopkins for undergrad, then to medical school, And she is now a genuinely excellent physician, a pediatric oncologist, someone who spends her days trying to save children with cancer, which is not a small or unworthy thing, and I want to be completely clear that my sister's achievement is real and that I have never once resented her for it. But Vivian carried something I didn't fully understand until much later. She carried the weight of being the daughter who didn't disappoint, and that weight, it turns out, is its own kind of prison. Every choice she made was measured against the standard. Every success was expected rather than celebrated. And somewhere in there was the quiet, unspoken awareness that she was allowed to be loved in a way I no longer was conditional love, love that depended on maintenance, love that could be withdrawn if she, too, ever stepped out of line. For the first few years of my exile, Vivian and I barely spoke, not out of hostility, exactly. It was more that our parents had constructed a version of reality in which staying close to me was a kind of disloyalty, and Vivian, still living inside that reality, still dependent on it, could not fully cross the line to reach me without risking her own standing. She reached out exactly once, in my 4th year away, with a text message I still have. It said, "I don't think you failed at anything. I've never thought that. I just don't know how to say that out loud in this family. I'm sorry." There's one event during those 9 years that I've never told anyone the full version of, and I'm going to tell you now, because it was the lowest point, and because I think the low points matter as much as the vindication. In my 5th year away, my father had a health scare. A cardiac event, ironic, for a family of heart specialists that landed him, briefly, in his own hospital, in a bed on a ward he'd walked past 10,000 times as the man in charge. I found out about it from Daniel, who called me at 2 a.m, his voice tight. "It's your dad. He's okay. They think he's okay. But he's in the hospital and I thought you'd want to know." I drove through the night. 3 hours, in the dark, not fully knowing why I was going. Only knowing that whatever 9 years had done to us, he was my father, and he was in a hospital bed, and I couldn't not go. I arrived at dawn. I walked into the lobby of Brantley Medical Center, past the bronze plaque with our family name on it, and I went up to the ward, and I stood outside his room. Through the window in the door, I could see him. He was awake, sitting up, and my mother was beside him, and Vivian was there, and they were talking quietly, a family gathered around one of its own, and I stood outside the door, and I couldn't go in. Not because I was afraid, because I understood, standing there, that walking into that room would require me to perform a role in a story I was no longer part of. I would have to be the prodigal daughter, returning, humbled. I would have to accept, at least for the length of the visit, the family's framework that I was the one who'd left, the one who'd failed, the one graciously being allowed back to the bedside. And I couldn't do it, not even for my father in a hospital bed, because I had spent 5 years building a self that couldn't fit through that door without folding itself back into a shape it had outgrown. I stood outside that door for 20 minutes, and then a nurse came by, a woman about my age, kind eyes, clearly at the end of a long shift, and she asked if I was family. I said yes. She said, "You can go in, visiting hours started." And I said, "I know, I'm working up to it." And this nurse, this stranger, looked at me for a moment, with an understanding that startled me, and she said, "Family's complicated. Take whatever time you need, he's stable, there's no rush." And then she said something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is deciding what version of yourself you have to be in the same room with them. Take your time deciding. I didn't go in that day. I left. I drove 3 hours back home, and I called Daniel and asked him to make sure Dad was okay. And I never told anyone in my family that I had been there, that I had driven through the night, that I had stood outside the door for 20 minutes, unable to fold myself small enough to enter. My father recovered. He never knew I came. And I carried that day as a private wound for years, the day I loved my father enough to drive through the night and was too committed to my own hard-won self to walk through the door. I've made a kind of peace with it now, because I understand that the nurse was right. Loving someone shouldn't require you to become a smaller version of yourself to be in the room with them. And the fact that it did, that day, wasn't a failure of my love. It was evidence of how much damage the family's certainty had done that a daughter could love her father enough to drive all night and still not be able to enter his hospital room. Because entering meant disappearing. That's what the standard cost us. Not just 9 years of holidays. It cost us the ability to be in a room together as our actual selves. I wrote back, "I know. It's okay. When you're ready, I'll be here." And then we didn't really speak again for almost 4 more years, because being ready, in a family like ours, is not a small thing. It costs something. And Vivian wasn't able to pay that cost until much later, under circumstances neither of us could have predicted. Let me tell you what those 9 years actually contained, because the version my family told the easier road was so completely, almost comically wrong, that even now, it's hard for me to believe they managed to believe it. After I finished my degree, I took a job at a mid-sized design firm in Boston, doing product design work that was competent and unremarkable, and taught me the discipline of designing for real constraints rather than for a professor's approval. I was good at it. I was, specifically, good at a thing that turned out to matter enormously. I was good at designing medical devices. There is a particular irony here that was not lost on me. The daughter who refused to become a doctor turned out to have a rare talent for designing the tools that doctors use. I want to sit with that irony for a moment because it's the center of everything. My whole childhood, my family treated my design instinct as a distraction from medicine, as the thing pulling me away from my real purpose. But that instinct hadn't formed in opposition to medicine, it had formed inside it. Every Saturday morning in my father's office, holding instruments and asking why they were shaped the way they were. Every late-night kitchen conversation with my mother about the elegant solution to a surgical problem. Every dinner table conversation I absorbed by osmosis, the specific vocabulary of the operating room, the way surgeons think about the body as a system of problems to be solved. I hadn't rejected my family's world. I had absorbed it so completely that I could see, in a way that no outside designer ever could, exactly where its tools were failing the people who use them. The surgeons I designed for were always astonished by how well I understood their needs. How do you know this? One of them asked me once, after I'd anticipated a problem he hadn't even articulated yet. You talk about this like you've been in the OR for 20 years. I didn't tell him the truth, which was that I'd been absorbing the language of the OR since before I could read, at a dinner table where it was the only language spoken. My family had made me a designer without ever intending to. They had given me the one thing that made my work exceptional, a native fluency in the world of medicine, and then disowned me for using it in a way they didn't recognize. There's no irony in the world quite as complete as that one. My background growing up in a family of surgeons, absorbing the language and logic of medicine through the walls of my childhood, whether I wanted to or not, gave me an intuition for medical device design that most designers, who had never watched a surgeon describe exactly why an instrument's handle was 2 millimeters too thick, simply did not have. 4 years into my career, I designed a surgical instrument. I won't describe the specifics, both because they're proprietary and because they'd bore you, that solved a problem surgeons had been quietly working around for decades. It was the kind of solution that seems obvious in retrospect, and that no one had managed to actually build. My firm patented it. It went into production, and within 18 months, it was being used in operating rooms across the country, including, though I didn't know it at the time, the operating rooms at Brantley Medical Center, the hospital with my family's name on the lobby plaque. My father, the chief of surgery, was using an instrument I had designed without any idea that his failed daughter had designed it. I left the firm at 26 and started my own company. I had a co-founder, an incredible woman named Priya, who handled the business side while I handled design, and we built a medical device startup that did something genuinely new. I'm going to stay vague on the specifics, but I'll tell you the shape of it. We designed a category of surgical tools that made certain complex procedures measurably safer, and we did it well enough, and fast enough, that we caught the attention of the entire medical device industry. By the time my sister's wedding invitation arrived, and it did arrive, which surprised me, addressed in Vivian's handwriting rather than my mother's, I was the co-founder and chief design officer of a company that had just closed a funding round that valued us at a number I still sometimes have trouble saying out loud. I want to tell you one story from my company's work, because it's the story that, more than any award or funding round, told me I had made the right choice at 19. About a year before the wedding, we got a letter, an actual handwritten letter, which almost no one sends anymore, from a surgeon in Ohio, a pediatric surgeon, specifically, who operated on infants, on hearts smaller than a walnut, in procedures where a fraction of a millimeter is the difference between a child who grows up and a child who doesn't. She wrote to tell us that one of our instruments, a tool I had designed specifically to give surgeons more control during microsurgery, had allowed her to complete a procedure on a newborn that she said, in her letter, she was not certain she could have completed with the older tools. The baby lived. The surgeon wrote that she had operated for 22 years and had never written to a device company before, but that she wanted the people who designed the tool to know that a specific child, with a specific name, was alive partly because of the thing we had made. I read that letter in my office, alone, and I cried, which I did not do often anymore by that point, because here is the thing my family never understood, the thing that all their certainty about my failure had blinded them to. They thought that by refusing to become a doctor, I had walked away from the work of saving lives. They thought design was decoration, that it was arts and crafts, that it was the easier road. But I had found a way to be in that operating room in Ohio, my hands guiding that surgeon's hands through my design, helping to save a newborn's life, and I had done it as exactly who I actually was, using exactly the talent they had told me didn't count. I hadn't walked away from meaningful work. I had found a door into it that they didn't even know existed, because they were so certain there was only one door, the one they had walked through, the one with their family name on the plaque. I kept that surgeon's letter. It's framed in my office now. When I doubt myself, and I still do, sometimes, 9 years of being told you're a failure doesn't fully wash out. I read it again. A specific child is alive. That's not the easier road. That's just a different road to the same place my family thought only they knew how to reach. I need to tell you about Priya, my co-founder, because she is one of the most important people in this entire story, and because the company we built together was not a solo triumph. No matter how the wedding night version might make it sound, I met Priya at the design firm, where she worked on the business side, the least glamorous, most essential function, the person who made sure that good design actually reached the people who needed it. Priya was the daughter of immigrants who had run a small business, and she had a kind of practical fearlessness about building things that I, raised in a family where the only acceptable path was a predefined one, completely lacked. She looked at my late-night designs one day. I'd made the mistake of leaving my portfolio open on my desk, and she said, "Why are you doing this at a firm that's going to own all of it? Why aren't we doing this ourselves?" She said we before we had ever discussed working together. That's the kind of person Priya is. We left the firm together within 6 months. We had almost no money. We had my designs and her business sense, and a shared, stubborn conviction that we could build something that mattered. The first year was terrifying in a way I had never experienced, the specific terror of building something with no safety net, no family money, no fallback, nothing but the two of us, and a conviction that could not pay rent. There was a stretch, about 8 months in, where we nearly failed. We had run out of runway, a deal had fallen through. And I remember sitting in our tiny rented office with Priya at 11 at night, both of us exhausted, and Priya said, "If this doesn't work, I want you to know I don't regret it. Building something real and having it fail is better than never building anything at all." And I thought about my family, all of them, maintaining the machine, never risking anything, never building anything new, and I realized that I would rather fail at something that was mine than succeed at something that was theirs. It didn't fail. 3 weeks after that late-night conversation, we closed the deal that saved us, and from there, slowly and then quickly, the company became what it became. But I never forgot that night, or what Priya said, because it captured the exact thing my family never understood, that the willingness to build something that might fail is not recklessness. It's the only path to building something that's actually yours. By the time the wedding invitation arrived, Priya and I employed 40 people. 40 people whose jobs existed because a failed designer and the daughter of immigrant shopkeepers had decided to build something. I thought about that a lot. My family measured success by titles and plaques and the maintenance of a standard. I had built something that put food on 40 families' tables, and none of my relatives knew it existed. I want to tell you about the moment I found out my father was using my design, because it's one of the strangest and most quietly devastating moments of the whole 9 years, and it happened almost by accident. About 2 years before the wedding, our company's sales team sent me a routine report, a list of the hospitals that had adopted our flagship surgical instrument. I skimmed it the way you skim a spreadsheet, half paying attention, until my eye caught a name near the middle of the list: Brantley Medical Center. Adoption date, purchase volume, the name of the surgeon who had championed its adoption within the department. Dr. William Harmon, my father, chief of surgery, had, according to this spreadsheet, personally advocated for the adoption of my instrument across his entire surgical department, praising it in the internal evaluation as, and our sales rep had quoted this in the notes, the most significant ergonomic improvement to this class of instrument in 20 years. He had no idea he was praising my work. He had championed a tool designed by the daughter he'd told the family was failing, and he had done it purely on the merits, because the tool was genuinely good, because it solved a real problem. Because my father, whatever else he was a serious surgeon who recognized excellence when it was in his hand. I sat with that spreadsheet for a long time. I want to tell you I felt triumph. I mostly felt something stranger and sadder, a kind of vertigo at the completeness of the disconnect. My father and I were, in the most literal possible way, working together. My hands, through the instrument I'd designed, were in his operating room, making his work safer, helping him save lives. We were collaborating on the most important work of both our lives, and he didn't know it. The wall of his certainty about who I was had become so complete that even my physical presence in his operating room, in the form of the tool he held during every surgery, couldn't penetrate it. I never told him. For 2 years, I carried the knowledge that we were secretly collaborating, and I let him carry his ignorance, because there was no way to tell him that wouldn't have sounded like a boast, and because some part of me, the hardened part, the part that had learned not to need his approval, took a quiet, private satisfaction in knowing something so enormous that he didn't. It was, I'll admit, not my most generous impulse, but after 9 years of being invisible, there was a strange power in being invisible on my own terms, in his own operating room, every single day. There's a version of this story where I became bitter, and I want to talk about it honestly, because I came closer to it than the triumphant ending might suggest. Around year 6, before the company really took off, I went through a period where the hardness I'd developed started to curdle into something uglier. I had learned not to need my family's approval, which was healthy, But somewhere in there, I'd also started to define myself entirely in opposition to them, to make every choice partly as a rebuke, to want success not just for its own sake, but as a weapon, as proof, as the thing I'd someday wave in their faces. I started dating someone during that period who pointed it out to me, gently, one night. He said, "You talk about your family a lot for people you claim not to care about." And I got angry, because he was right, and being right about that was unbearable. Because here's the trap, and I think a lot of people who've been underestimated fall into it. If you build your entire life as a response to the people who doubted you, then they still own you. Your success isn't yours, it's a reaction to them. Every achievement is still, secretly, addressed to them, a letter you're writing to people who aren't reading. You've escaped their approval and replaced it with your need for their eventual regret, which is just approval wearing a different mask. It took me about a year to work my way out of that trap, and I didn't fully manage it until I stopped imagining the moment of vindication entirely. There was a specific day, I couldn't tell you the date, when I realized that I'd been designing a product and I hadn't thought about my family once during the entire process. Not as motivation, not as future audience, not at all. I designed it purely because the problem was interesting, and the solution was good. And I understood that this was what actual freedom felt like. Not triumphing over them, but forgetting to think about them at all. The wedding, when it came, was almost an accident. By the time Catherine Ashford crossed that ballroom, I had genuinely stopped needing the moment she created. Which is, I think, the only reason I was able to enjoy it without being consumed by it. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday. I want to tell you honestly that I almost didn't open it. I recognized Vivian's handwriting on the envelope, and I sat with it unopened on my kitchen counter for 2 full days. Because I knew that opening it would pull me back toward a family I had spent 9 years learning to live without. When I finally opened it, there was a handwritten note tucked inside the formal invitation. It said, "Rachel, I'm getting married. I want you there, not the version of you that mom and dad talk about, but you, my actual sister. I know I haven't earned the right to ask. I know I stayed quiet for too many years, but I'm asking anyway. Please come, V." And below that, in smaller writing, almost as an afterthought, I finally said it out loud, by the way, that you didn't fail at anything. I said it to Mom's face. It did not go well, but I said it. I read that note probably 20 times, and then I RSVP'd yes, and I made a decision that I want to be honest about, because it wasn't entirely noble. I decided that I would go to the wedding as exactly who I actually was, not to make a scene, not to humiliate anyone. But I was done, permanently and completely, with being smaller than I was in order to make my family comfortable. If they wanted to keep believing I'd taken the easier road, they were welcome to, but I wasn't going to help them do it anymore. Before I tell you what happened at that wedding, I want to ask you something, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most. Has anyone in your life decided who you are, permanently, based on a single choice you made years ago and then simply stopped updating that picture, no matter how much you changed? Type "updated" in the comments if you've lived that. If you've ever had to stand in front of someone who loved you and watch them look at a version of you that stopped being true a long time ago. Because the hardest part of this whole story isn't the moment of vindication that's coming. It's the 9 years I spent being invisible to the people who were supposed to know me best. Stay with me. We're almost to the wedding. The morning of the wedding, I nearly didn't go through with wearing what I wore, or being who I decided to be. I stood in front of my closet for a long time. I had 2 options laid out on my bed, and they represented 2 entirely different decisions. One was a modest, forgettable outfit, the kind of thing that would let me slip into the back of the wedding, be quietly present, and slip out again without disturbing anything. The armor of invisibility I'd worn to family events my whole life. The other was the green dress. The dress that I loved, that made me feel like myself, that had nothing to prove, and therefore proved everything. I stood there for 20 minutes, genuinely torn. Because wearing the green dress meant walking into that room as myself, and walking in as myself meant risking the specific pain of being fully present and still being treated as invisible. There's a particular cruelty to being ignored when you've shown up as your whole self. It's much safer to be ignored when you've deliberately made yourself small, because then you can tell yourself they're ignoring the small version, not the real you. I put on the green dress, and I want to be honest about the thought that finally decided it, because it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet. I thought, I have spent 9 years becoming someone I'm proud of. If they can't see her, that's a fact about their eyes, not about her. And I'm not going to hide her to make their blindness more comfortable. I drove to the wedding in the green dress with my hands steady on the wheel, having no idea, none, that Catherine Ashford would be there. I made my decision to show up as myself before I had any reason to believe it would be rewarded. I think that matters. I didn't walk in as myself because I knew vindication was coming. I walked in as myself because I had finally decided that being myself was worth doing even if no one ever noticed. The vindication was an accident. The self-respect was a choice. The wedding was held at a historic estate outside Boston. the kind of venue that costs more than most people's annual salary to rent for a single evening, the kind of place my family considered appropriate for a Harmon wedding. The drive to the estate took 50 minutes, and I spent most of it doing something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. Remembering the good parts of my family, the parts that existed before the standard swallowed everything, because it wasn't all cold. That's the thing these stories flatten. My father, before I became a disappointment, used to take me to the hospital on Saturday mornings sometimes, and let me sit in his office while he did paperwork. And he'd explain what the different instruments on a shelf were for, and I'd hold them and feel their weight, and ask why this one was shaped this way and not another way questions. I realized much later that were already the questions of a designer, though neither of us knew it then. He was patient with those questions. He seemed, in those Saturday mornings, to genuinely enjoy them. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if he'd been able to see that the girl asking why the instrument was shaped that way was already, at 8 years old, the person who would grow up to reshape it. But he couldn't see it. He saw a future surgeon asking surgeons questions, and when I turned out to be a designer asking designers questions, the questions suddenly stopped counting. My mother, before everything, used to stay up with me when I couldn't sleep, and we'd sit in the kitchen and she'd tell me about surgeries, not the gory parts, the problem-solving parts. The way you had to think 3 steps ahead, the way the body surprised you and you had to adapt. I loved those late-night kitchen conversations. I understand now that what I loved wasn't medicine. It was watching my mother solve problems, watching a brilliant mind work through something difficult in real time. That's a thing designers and surgeons share, actually the love of an elegant solution to a hard problem. My mother and I were, underneath everything, the same kind of mind pointed at different objects. Maybe that's why she couldn't forgive me. It's easy to disown someone who's nothing like you. It's much harder to disown someone who is exactly like you but chose differently, because their choice is a permanent question mark hanging over your own. I let myself remember all of this on the drive, the good and the cold both, and by the time I pulled up to the estate, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not even nervousness, but a kind of grief. Grief for the family we might have been if the standard hadn't eaten us. Grief for the Saturday mornings and the late-night kitchen talks that stopped the day I chose myself. I walked into that wedding not looking for revenge, but carrying a quiet sadness for everything that had been lost to 9 years of everyone being too proud and too certain to simply look at each other clearly. Let me tell you what that first hour at the back table was actually like, because I think the humiliation of it matters for understanding what came after. I was seated with my cousin Daniel, my one ally, and a collection of distant relatives, and what I came to understand were my parents' least important professional connections. Across the table was a man named Gerald, some kind of hospital administrator, who spent the first 20 minutes of dinner explaining to me, in great and condescending detail, what it was like to work in a real medical environment, having been told, apparently, that I was in design and having concluded that this meant I decorated waiting rooms. It's a whole different world, Gerald told me, gesturing with his fork. The pressure, the stakes. Not everyone's cut out for it. Your parents, now extraordinary people, your father especially. You must be very proud to come from a family like that. I am, I said, and I meant it in a way Gerald could not possibly have understood. And what is it you design exactly? He asked in the tone of someone making polite conversation with the help. Medical devices, I said. Oh, like the packaging? The little labels? He chuckled. Someone's got to do it, I suppose. Beside me, Daniel had gone very still. Daniel knew. Daniel was the one relative who had actually kept up with my life, who knew exactly what I'd built, and I could feel him vibrating with the desire to correct Gerald and the awareness that it wasn't his moment to do it. Something like that, I said to Gerald, and I let him believe it, because I had learned long ago that I did not need to correct people's small ideas about me. Their small ideas were their problem, not mine. My mother passed our table once during dinner, doing the rounds a mother of the bride does, greeting guests. She paused at our table, greeted Gerald warmly by name, greeted the distant cousins, and gave me the same cool nod she'd given me across the room. Rachel, she said. I'm glad you could make it. As though I were a former colleague, she'd invited out of obligation. Then she moved on to a more important table. I want to be honest that it stung. 9 years of learning not to need her approval, and it still stung, sitting at the back table while my mother worked the room, being condescended to by a man who thought I designed labels. I mention this because I think these stories sometimes pretend that the person who's been wronged rises above it all with perfect serenity. I didn't. I sat there, and it hurt, and I got through it, which is different from rising above it. I got through it because I had gotten through 9 years of it, and I had learned that the hurt was survivable, and that survival was its own kind of strength. And then, about an hour into the reception, there was a commotion near the entrance. About an hour into the reception, after dinner but before the dancing, there was a small commotion near the entrance. A late arrival. Someone important enough that a ripple of attention moved through the room, heads turning. The specific energy shift that happens when someone significant enters a space. I didn't look up at first. I was in the middle of a conversation with a second cousin about her kid's school. It was my cousin, Daniel, seated beside me, who went suddenly still and said, under his breath, "Rachel, isn't that?" I looked up. Standing near the entrance, being greeted with obvious deference by the venue staff, was Dr. Catherine Ashford. And here I need to explain who Catherine Ashford is, because her presence is the entire hinge of this story. Catherine Ashford is the president and CEO of one of the largest hospital networks in the country, a former surgeon who had transitioned into medical leadership and become, over 2 decades, one of the most powerful and influential figures in American medicine. She sat on the boards of medical schools. She controlled the purchasing decisions of dozens of hospitals. She was, specifically, exactly the kind of person my parents had spent their entire careers trying to get close to, the kind of person whose attention could make or unmake a medical career. My parents did not know Catherine Ashford personally. I knew this because it had been a subject of some frustration in my family for years. My mother had tried more than once to get a meeting with her, through channels, through connections, and had never quite managed it. Catherine Ashford was, to my parents, the summit they had never reached. And Catherine Ashford's hospital network had, 6 months earlier, become my company's single largest client. She and I had spent dozens of hours together over the previous year. She had personally championed the adoption of our surgical tools across her entire network. She was, in the specific way that these things happen in business, something between a mentor and a partner to me. And she had mentioned, weeks earlier, that she'd be in Boston for an event the same weekend as Vivian's wedding. And I had mentioned, offhand, that my sister was getting married that weekend. And she had said, with the warmth she showed exactly no one in a professional context, "Rachel, I would love to meet the family that made you." I had forgotten she said it. I genuinely had. I had not, for 1 second, connected her Boston trip to the possibility that she would actually appear at my sister's wedding. But there she was. And she was scanning the room. And when her eyes found me, her entire face changed into a smile of genuine delight, and she began to walk toward me across the entire length of that ballroom. Past my mother's cluster of medical colleagues, past my father at the head table, past 300 guests who all knew exactly who she was and were watching her cross the room with visible astonishment. She walked past all of them, and she stopped at my table, at the back of the room, and extended her hand to me, and said, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "Rachel Harmon, the most talented designer in American medicine. I was hoping you'd be here." I want to describe the silence that spread out from that moment, because it moved through the room in a specific and unforgettable way. It started at my table, with the distant cousins who had spent the evening making polite, slightly condescending conversation with me suddenly recalculating everything. It spread to the neighboring tables, where my parents' lesser colleagues were turning to look. And it traveled, like a current, all the way across the ballroom to where my mother stood frozen with her cluster of surgeons, and to my father at the head table, who, I saw this clearly, set down his champagne glass on the table so hard that the stem cracked, a small sharp sound in the growing quiet. Catherine Ashford, either not noticing or, more likely, noticing perfectly well and choosing to continue, kept talking. "I've been trying to get Rachel to consult for our entire network," she said warmly, to me, but also effectively, to the room. "Do you know what this woman built? She's redesigning how surgery works. Genuinely. I have surgeons with 30 years of experience telling me her tools changed how they operate." I saw my mother begin to move toward us, the specific, careful movement of a woman navigating a social situation that had just detonated in a way she didn't understand. "Catherine," my mother said, arriving at the table with a smile I recognized as the one she used for the most important people in any room. "Eleanor Harmon, I don't think we've had the pleasure, and here is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life." Catherine Ashford turned to my mother, and her expression shifted from warmth to a cool, assessing politeness, and she said, "Harmon, of course. You must be so proud of Rachel." My mother's face. I wish I could fully describe my mother's face in that moment. The collision of 9 years of a carefully maintained story slamming directly into a reality she had no framework for. Because Catherine Ashford was not congratulating her on Vivian, the doctor, she was congratulating her on me, the failure, the one who took the easier road. And my mother, standing in front of the single most important person in her professional universe, could not correct her, could not explain, could not do anything except perform a pride she had spent 9 years refusing to feel. "Yes," my mother said faintly, "we are." The reception continued, of course. Weddings are resilient that way. But something had fundamentally shifted in that room, and everyone in it knew. Over the next hour, I experienced something I had never experienced at a family gathering in my entire life. I watched my parents' colleagues, one by one, find excuses to come speak to me, to ask about my company, to mention, with careful casualness, that they'd love to talk sometime. The same people who had spent the early evening looking through me were now seeking me out, because Catherine Ashford had, in a single crossing of a ballroom, Completely rewritten my status in a room full of people who traded in status. I found no particular joy in that, honestly. It was too transparent, too dependent on someone else's validation, and I had spent 9 years learning not to need exactly that kind of thing. But I noted it. I filed it away as a lesson about how the world actually works. The moment that mattered came later. Near the end of the night, Vivian found me. My sister, in her wedding dress, on the most important night of her life, pulled me into a quiet corner away from the crowd, and I could see that she had been crying, and not from wedding happiness. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me get through it." I waited. "I have spent my whole life being the one who did it right," Vivian said. "And I told myself that made me the lucky one, that you got exiled and I got to stay. But Rachel, I have spent 9 years watching them love me because I'm useful to the story they tell about themselves. And tonight I watched the most powerful woman in medicine walk across a room to shake your hand, and I watched Mom's face, and I realized something I've been afraid to realize for years." She took a breath. "You're the only one of us who's actually free. You're the only one who ever got to find out who you'd be if you weren't a Harmon. And I've been jealous of that for years, and calling it disappointment, because that's what Mom and Dad taught me to call it." I didn't say anything. I just held my sister's hands in that quiet corner. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the 9 years, for staying quiet, for every Sunday dinner where I let them say the easier road and didn't throw my drink in someone's face. I'm sorry." "You said it out loud, eventually," I told her. "You said it to Mom's face. That counts for more than you know." "It cost me," she said, with a small, wet laugh. "You have no idea. Mom didn't speak to me for a month." "I have some idea, actually," I said, and we both laughed. The specific laugh of two people who have survived the same house. I mentioned that after Catherine Ashford crossed the room, my parents' colleagues began to seek me out. I want to describe this more fully, because it taught me something about the world that I've never forgotten. Gerald, the hospital administrator who had spent dinner explaining that I probably designed labels, appeared at my elbow perhaps 30 minutes after Catherine's arrival. Having clearly done some rapid research on his phone, his entire demeanor had transformed. "Rachel," he said warmly, as though we were old friends. "I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were in design, but I didn't realize you were the Rachel Harmon. Harmon Medical Design. My hospital has been trying to get on your client list for a year." He laughed, nervously. "I feel like I should apologize for boring you with hospital administration earlier. You know more about the industry than I ever will." I looked at Gerald, this man who an hour earlier had been congratulating me on coming from such an impressive family while explaining that not everyone was cut out for real medicine, and who was now falling over himself because a powerful woman had validated me in public. And I felt, honestly, a little sorry for him. Because Gerald was a perfect illustration of how most of the world actually works. People don't assess your worth directly. They look around to see who else has assessed it, and they copy the answer. An hour earlier, the room had assessed me as the failed Harmon daughter, and Gerald had dutifully copied that assessment. Now, the most powerful person in the room had assessed me as brilliant, and Gerald was dutifully copying that one instead. His opinion of me had never once been based on anything about me. It was based entirely on the room's consensus. "No apology necessary, Gerald," I told him. "You were just reading the room. Most people do." He didn't quite know what to do with that. He drifted away shortly after. I tell you this not to mock Gerald, but because understanding it set me free from something. For 9 years, part of me had been wounded by how easily my family and their world had accepted the story of my failure. But watching Gerald flip from condescension to flattery in the span of an hour, based on nothing but who had shaken my hand, I understood that the acceptance of my failure had never been personal, and neither was the sudden recognition of my success. Most people are Geralds. They read the room, they copy the consensus. The only people whose opinion of you actually means anything are the rare few who assess you directly, who look at you and decide for themselves, the Priyas, the Daniels, the Catherine Ashfords, who cross rooms because they've actually looked at your work and reached their own conclusion. Everyone else is just reflecting the room back at you. Once I understood that, the room lost its power over me entirely. There was one more encounter that night that I haven't told you about yet, and I saved it because it was, in some ways, the most difficult. My grandmother, the one who, 9 years earlier, had told me that no Harmon had ever chosen to be ordinary, and that I would be the first, was at the wedding. She was 90 now, in a wheelchair, sharper in some ways than ever, and softer in others, the way the very old sometimes become, and near the end of the night, she asked Daniel to wheel her over to me. I braced myself. This was the woman whose single sentence had echoed through 9 years of my life, the woman who had articulated the family's judgment more precisely and more woundingly than anyone. She looked up at me from her wheelchair for a long moment, and then she said, "I heard what that Ashford woman said, about you being the most talented designer in American medicine." "Yes," I said. "I said you'd chosen to be ordinary," my grandmother said. Her voice was steady. "I remember saying it. I've thought about it over the years." I waited. I was wrong about the ordinary part. she said. But I want to tell you something, because I'm 90, and I don't have time to be delicate. I wasn't really warning you against being ordinary. I was warning you against being free, because I never was. I was one of the first women in my medical school, and I was so proud of that, and I never once, in my whole life, asked myself whether I actually wanted it or whether I just wanted to prove I could do what the men did. I chose the standard. I chose it so hard and so completely that I made everyone who came after me choose it too. And you were the first one brave enough to say no. She reached out and took my hand, her grip papery and surprisingly strong. I called that ordinary. It was the least ordinary thing anyone in this family has ever done. I'm sorry it took me 90 years and a stranger crossing a ballroom to say so. I knelt down beside her wheelchair and held my grandmother's hand, this woman who had been both a pioneer and a prison guard, who had broken one barrier and then spent her life enforcing all the others. And I understood that she had been, in her way, as trapped as any of us, maybe more. My father found me as I was preparing to leave. He approached the way a man approaches something he doesn't know how to handle stiffly, formally, with none of the surgeon's confidence he wore everywhere else in his life. We stood together near the coat check, two people who hadn't had a real conversation in 9 years. I used an instrument last month, he said finally. New design, remarkable piece of engineering, solved a problem I'd been working around for 15 years. He looked at me. The rep told me the designer's name when I asked. Harmon Medical Design. I assumed it was a coincidence. A different Harmon. I didn't say anything. It wasn't a coincidence, was it? He said. It wasn't really a question. No, I said. It wasn't. My father was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that I did not expect, something that took me 9 years to hear and that I am still not entirely sure how to hold. I've been operating with your hands in the room, he said, for over a year, and I didn't know it. I told people you took the easier road, and the whole time, you were in my operating room, making my work better, and I didn't even know your name was on the instrument. His voice did something I had never heard it do. I don't know how to apologize for 9 years, he said. I don't think there's a way to do it that isn't insulting to how long it was. So I'm not going to try to do it all tonight, but I want you to know that I know. I finally know what I did. And I know it took the most powerful woman in medicine walking across a ballroom for me to see something I should have seen from the beginning. I want to give Daniel his moment, because he earned it over 9 years, and because loyalty that quiet deserves to be named. Daniel was the one relative who never fully let me disappear. Through all 9 years, he texted. He called on my birthday. He sent me a link when he saw an article that mentioned my company, with a message that just said, "Is this you?" Followed by, when I confirmed it was, I knew it. I've been telling people for years you were going to be huge, and everyone thought I was being nice. He came to visit me in Boston twice, told no one in the family he was doing it, and sat in my apartment eating takeout and telling me family gossip and treating me, for a few hours, like I was still part of the family I'd been edited out of. At the wedding, after Catherine Ashford's grand entrance, after Gerald's transformation, after my sister's tearful apology and my father's halting near apology, and my grandmother's 90 years late reckoning, Daniel found me by the coat check as I was leaving. He didn't make a speech, he just hugged me, hard, and said into my ear, "I never needed a famous person to walk across a room to know what you were. I've known since you redesigned your bedroom when we were 12. And then he pulled back and grinned and said, "But, I have to admit." Watching Gerald nearly swallow his own tongue was extremely satisfying. I laughed, and I hugged my cousin, the one person in my family who had assessed me directly for 28 years and never once needed the room's permission to do it. And I thought, this is what it actually looks like to be known. Not the grand vindication, not the powerful stranger crossing the room. Just one person who looked at you clearly, decided for themselves, and never wavered, through 9 years of everyone around them insisting on a different story. That's rarer than any award. That's the thing actually worth having. I had been featured in design publications. I had won awards in a field my grandmother would have called arts and crafts, and none of my family knew any of it, because they had stopped asking. Because a person you've decided is a failure is a person you stop being curious about. Their certainty about who I was had become a wall so complete that the actual facts of my life couldn't get through it. That wedding was 10 months ago. I would love to tell you that everything transformed overnight, that my family became whole, that 9 years dissolved in a single evening of vindication. That's not what happened, because that's not how real families work. And I promised you the truth. What happened was slower and, I think, more real. My father and I have had lunch 4 times since the wedding. The first one was almost unbearably awkward. The fourth one, last week, was almost normal. He asks about my work now, with a genuine curiosity that he never had when he assumed I had nothing worth being curious about. Last month, he asked if he could visit my company's office. I said yes. He walked through our design studio for 2 hours, asking questions like a surgeon. And at the end, he stood in front of a prototype and said, quietly, "You built this, without any of us. You built all of this, And I understood that he was, finally, actually seeing me. My mother is harder. My mother has not fully found her way to an apology because my mother built more of her identity on the story of my failure than my father did. And dismantling that story requires dismantling something in herself that she isn't sure she can live without. We are cordial now. We are not close. She sent me a birthday card this year, the first in 9 years, and inside she had written, "I am proud of you," and I know how much those 4 words cost her. And I have decided to accept them as the beginning of something rather than resenting them for arriving 9 years late. There was one conversation with my mother, about 4 months after the wedding, that I want to tell you about, because it's the closest we've come to the truth, and because it explains something about why the hardest people to be understood by are sometimes the ones who are most like us. We met for coffee, her idea, which surprised me. We sat in a cafe near her hospital, 2 women who looked alike, and had spent 9 years being strangers, and for a long time we talked about nothing. Vivian's pregnancy, the weather, safe things. And then my mother said, abruptly, "I need you to understand something. Not to excuse it, to understand it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from her. "When I was your age, I wanted to be a painter." I did not say anything. I had never heard this. Not once. In 28 years. "I was good," she said. "Good enough that a teacher told me I could do it professionally. And my father, your grandfather, told me that art was for people who couldn't do anything real. That I had a mind too good to waste on it, and I believed him. I went to medical school, and I became a surgeon, and I was good at it, and I built a career I'm genuinely proud of." She looked at me. "And then I had a daughter who wanted to do the exact thing I gave up. And instead of protecting you, I did to you exactly what my father did to me. Because if you were allowed to choose it, and you were allowed to be happy, then it meant," she stopped. "It meant you gave up something you didn't have to give up," I finished quietly. "Yes," she said. "And that was unbearable to me. It was easier to believe you had failed than to believe you had succeeded at the thing I was too afraid to try." I have thought about that conversation more than almost any other in my life. My mother's cruelty toward me was not really about me at all. It was about a 19-year-old girl, decades ago, who wanted to paint and was told she was too good to waste herself on it, and who had spent her entire life proving her own father right because the alternative was admitting he'd been wrong. My refusal to become a doctor didn't just break the family standard. It reopened a wound my mother had spent 40 years pretending had healed. It doesn't excuse the 9 years. My mother knows it doesn't, but it explains them. And there's a specific kind of peace that comes from finally understanding that the person who couldn't see you was, all along, unable to see a version of themselves. Vivian and I talk almost every day now. My sister, it turns out, was waiting her whole life for permission to have a real relationship with me. And now that she's given herself that permission, she's making up for lost time. She's pregnant, actually. I'm going to be an aunt. And she told me last week that if it's a girl, she wants me to teach her that it's okay to choose the road that's actually yours, even when your whole family is standing on a different one, telling you you're making a mistake. I need to tell you about a conversation I had with Catherine Ashford a few weeks after the wedding, because it reframed the whole evening for me, and because it revealed that her crossing the room had not been the spontaneous gesture I'd assumed. We were at a business dinner, and I finally asked her about it. "That night at my sister's wedding," I said, "when you walked across the room, did you know what you were walking into?" Catherine set down her wine and looked at me with the specific directness that made her both feared and respected across all of American medicine. "Rachel," she said, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I read a room the second I walk into it. I knew exactly what I was walking into." I waited. "I saw you at that back table," she said. "I saw where they'd seated you. I saw your mother holding court with the surgeons, and I saw your father at the head table, and I saw that you'd been placed as far from both of them as the seating chart allowed." It took me about 4 seconds to understand the entire situation. She smiled, but it wasn't entirely a warm smile. I've seen it 100 times. The talented one who didn't follow the family script, seated at the back, quietly tolerated. And I made a decision, in those 4 seconds, that I was going to walk across that room and shake your hand before I acknowledged a single other person, because I wanted every person in that room to watch me do it. "Why?" I asked. "Because I was you," Catherine said simply. 40 years ago. Different family, different details, same story. I was the one who didn't follow the script, and I spent a decade being quietly seated at the back of every family gathering, and no one ever crossed a room for me. I had to build my entire career without a single moment of that kind of validation from the people who should have given it freely. She picked her wine back up. "So when I get the chance to be the person who crosses the room, I take it, every single time. I've done it at maybe a dozen events over the years, for a dozen different people who reminded me of myself. It costs me nothing, and it changes everything for them. It's the cheapest and most powerful thing I know how to do." She looked at me. "You're going to be in my position someday, Rachel. Powerful enough that crossing a room means something. When you are, I want you to remember that wedding. And I want you to find the person seated at the back, the one everyone's decided to overlook, and I want you to walk across the room for them. That's the actual inheritance. Not the money, not the awards. The ability to cross a room and make everyone see someone they decided not to look at. I have thought about that conversation almost every day since, because Catherine Ashford gave me something at that dinner that was worth more than the largest contract we ever signed. She gave me a job to do with whatever power I accumulate, and I intend to do it. Somewhere, right now, there's a person being seated at the back of a room by a family that's decided they don't measure up. And someday, when I'm powerful enough that it means something, I'm going to cross that room. I arrived alone. I had thought about bringing someone, but in the end, I wanted to walk in as myself, unaccompanied, owing no one an explanation. I wore a deep green dress that I loved and that had nothing to prove, and I walked into that ballroom for the first time in 9 years, to find myself in a room full of my extended family, my parents' colleagues, and 300 people, many of whom knew me only as the Harmon daughter who hadn't made it. I saw my mother first. She was across the room, resplendent, in her element, holding court near the bar with a cluster of what I recognized instantly as medical colleagues, the specific body language of surgeons talking shop at a party. She saw me. I watched her see me. And I watched her face perform a small, complicated calculation, the calculation of a woman deciding how to handle the arrival of a daughter she'd spent 9 years explaining away. She gave me a small, cool nod. Not warmth. Acknowledgement. The nod you'd give an acquaintance, whose name you're struggling to remember. My father didn't acknowledge me at all at first. He was near the head table, champagne in hand, and when his eyes passed over me they simply kept moving, as though I were a piece of the furniture he didn't recognize, and had decided not to investigate. I found my seat. I had been placed, I noted, without much surprise, at a table near the back, with distant cousins and what appeared to be my parents' least important colleagues, the family's way of including me while making my status unmistakable. I sat down, I made polite conversation, and I waited for the evening to unfold, having decided that I would not force anything, that I would simply be present and let whatever happened happen. What I did not know, what nobody at my table knew, what my parents most certainly did not know, was who else had been invited to that wedding. I've thought a lot, since the wedding, about what I want to be for that baby, my niece or nephew, the next Harmon, the one who'll grow up in the long shadow of the Standard. Because here's what I know. The Standard isn't gone. My family didn't dissolve their entire value system because a powerful woman crossed a ballroom. My parents are still surgeons who believe, in their bones, that certain paths are worthy, and others aren't. Vivian is going to raise her child in the same extended family that raised us, with the same grandmother's ghost of no Harmon has ever chosen to be ordinary, hanging in the air. Even now that my grandmother herself has taken it back, the machine is still running. It just has one visible crack in it now, and the crack is me. So I've decided what I'm going to be for that child. I'm going to be the aunt who asks what they actually love, and then takes it seriously, not as a hobby, not as a cute distraction, but as a real thing that might be their real life. I'm going to be the one who, when they bring home a drawing, looks at it for longer than 3 seconds. I'm going to be the living proof, sitting right there at every Sunday dinner, that you can step off the family's path, and not only survive, but build something that makes the people who doubted you cross rooms to shake your hand. I'm going to be the door I didn't know existed when I was 19, standing open, visible, for a kid who might need to walk through it someday. That, more than any contract or award or moment of vindication, is what those 9 years were actually for. Not so that I could triumph over my family. So that the next kid, who's a little bit different, a little bit off the standard, a little bit more themselves than the family knows what to do with, so that kid has someone in the room who already made it out, and made it beautiful, and came back to leave the door open. I want to leave you with one more thought before the end, because it's the thing this whole story taught me that I most want you to carry with you. The people in my family weren't evil. I need you to understand that, because it would be easier if they were. Easy villains make for clean stories, and this isn't a clean story. My parents loved me. My grandmother loved me. They disowned someone they loved, told a false story about someone they loved, seated someone they loved at the back of a room, and they did all of it while genuinely loving me. Because their love had a condition attached to it that they couldn't even see, the way you can't see the water you're swimming in. The condition was certainty. They were certain they knew what a good life looked like, certain they knew what success required, certain that the path they'd walked was the only path to anything worthwhile. And that certainty was so total, so unquestioned, that it overrode the evidence of their own daughter's life. It made them unable to update, unable to look again, unable to see the person standing right in front of them, because they already knew they were certain who that person was. That's the real villain of this story. Not my mother, not my father, not my grandmother. Certainty itself. The specific human failure of deciding you already know someone, and then closing the book, and never opening it again no matter how much they change. Every person in my family was a good person, made cruel by certainty, and the tragedy is that certainty always feels like knowledge from the inside. My mother didn't feel like she was being closed-minded. She felt like she knew. That's what makes it so dangerous. The person who has stopped looking at you is always convinced they see you perfectly. So here's what I want you to take from 9 years of my life. Stay curious about the people you love, especially the ones you're most certain about. Especially the ones you've already decided you understand. Because the moment you become certain about a person is the moment you stop actually seeing them and start seeing only the version of them you've stored in your head, a version that stopped updating the day your certainty set in. My family stored a version of me at 19 and never updated it for 9 years. Don't do that to the people you love. Keep looking, keep updating, keep letting them surprise you. It's the only way to actually know someone, as opposed to merely being certain about them. And Catherine Ashford, in case you're wondering, Catherine never mentioned the wedding again, never acknowledged the bomb she detonated in that ballroom. But a few weeks later, over a business dinner, she said something offhand that I've thought about ever since. Families like yours, she said, produce a very particular kind of person. Either someone who spends their whole life maintaining the machine, or someone who walks away and builds something new. I've always been much more interested in the second kind. She smiled. The maintainers are useful, but the builders are the ones who actually change medicine. Before I go, I have a question for you, and I'd genuinely like an honest answer in the comments. Has anyone in your life decided who you are, and then simply stopped paying attention, stopped updating that picture no matter how much you grew, no matter what you built, no matter how completely you became someone they never bothered to notice? And when they finally saw the truth, whenever and however it arrived, what did it cost them to have been so wrong for so long? I ask because I've learned something over 9 years and one wedding that I don't think I could have learned any other way. The people who are most certain they know exactly who you are very often the people who stopped looking at you a long time ago. Their certainty isn't knowledge. It's the opposite of knowledge. It's what fills the space where curiosity used to be. My family was certain I had failed, and their certainty was so complete, so total, that the actual facts of my life, the company, the awards, the instrument in my own father's operating room simply couldn't reach them. They had stopped looking, and it took someone from entirely outside our family, walking across a ballroom, to make them look again. Don't wait for a Catherine Ashford to cross the room before you look closely at the people you think you already understand. And if you're the one who's been decided about, the one who's been filed away as a disappointment, build anyway. Build quietly. Build for yourself. Build without needing them to see it. Because the building is yours, whether they ever notice it or not. And one day, if you're lucky, someone will cross a crowded room to shake your hand first, and the people who stopped looking will finally, suddenly, be forced to see. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, maybe someone who's currently being underestimated by the people who should know them best. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way through. My name is Rachel Harmon. I'm 28 years old. My family was certain I had chosen to be ordinary. And it turns out the most extraordinary thing I ever did was refuse to let their certainty become my ceiling.